I'm Patrick. I've spent the last 4 years of my life thinking over a plan for how to get revenge on my dad's former boss for all that he's done to our family. I was born into a family of a housewife and a handyman. So as you might have guessed, our family's never been rich in terms of money. But Mum always said she would never exchange our way of living for anything else because she was always sure that nobody would ever say that we weren't decent. And she was very proud of both me and my dad, who were always ready to give a hand to someone who was in need. He always said that I should be a good person and that good things would happen to me. This huge tragedy happened to our family when I was 13. Back then, my dad had been working at a construction plant for several months already, and he was saying that after he finished everything and got paid, we could finally afford to go on a family vacation together, and that was really encouraging. But one day, when I was doing my homework, sitting in the kitchen, and Mum was cooking and helping me with some stuff, we got a call on our landline. It was a doctor from the local hospital, who said that an accident had happened right where my dad was working. The cable broke in an elevator shaft, and unfortunately, he got hurt badly. He died in the ambulance on his way to the hospital, from the internal injuries. Of course, we rushed to that hospital. It was horrible. Tears were constantly streaming down my mum's face, no matter whether she was driving her ancient car, or listening to what the doctor was telling her, or saying goodbye to her husband, when they finally let us see him. I thought that the whole world had cracked, and that there was nothing worse than that. During the whole funeral, and the wake thing, everybody kept coming up to me, to say their condolences, and to tell me that from now on, I was the main man for the family, and the only supporter and defender my mum had now. Yeah, I sort of already was aware of that. A few days later, I found my mum crying hard again. I tried to calm her down, saying that she had to let go of her grief, because even the Reverend said that we shouldn't mourn for too long, you know? To make it easier for Dad's soul to be able to leave and go wherever it was supposed to go. But Mum said that she was crying for another reason. She'd just found out that she was pregnant. It was kind of hard to react properly to this news, and not only for me, but for my mum also. On the one hand, we'd just buried my dad, and I personally felt that I wasn't allowed to be happy yet. But on the other hand, as some believers may also assume, it was as if Dad's soul was coming back again, in this baby, and it was kind of amazing. Of course, this also meant some extra spending for the family budget, which was extremely low, but as Mum said, this baby was a blessing from God, and will eventually handle everything. And then, we received a compensation check from the insurance company. Mum said that the sum of money that they sent was dramatically small. Of course, I was too young myself to understand anything. But as soon as Mum saw it, she got really angry, and she started accusing Dad's boss of being mean and greedy. By the way, he never called us or came to us to offer us any help or money, or at least to check how we were doing without a dad. Mum also said that she was sure the boss guy had a hand in what happened to my dad, having cheated with the insurance documents, and he was for sure neglecting security measures. Jesus, I've never seen my mum that furious before. I'm pretty sure that if Mum wasn't pregnant back then, or if I was a bit older, we would have sued that company, or my dad's former boss, or both. But when Mum calmed down a bit, she said that these companies usually have a bunch of lawyers who would have never allowed a simple pregnant woman with a kid to win a case against them. That's why we should just calm down and find the strength in our hearts to forgive them and move on. But then my brother was born, and he wasn't really physically healthy, and doctors said that stress was to blame for everything. Now I know that Mum was right, saying that being angry will never be helpful to anyone. But back then, I kept mulling this situation over and over in my head, and imagining how different our life would be if my dad was alive. And I just felt this hatred growing inside of me. I couldn't stop myself from sending curses to that boss's family, or blaming him in everything that he did to us. Of course, I found myself a part-time job, and then one more part-time job, and I tried to help Mum with a baby and everything. But every single spare minute I had been thinking about that boss. What would I tell him if we once meet? And how could I possibly revenge him for the death of my father and the illness of my little brother. I never told Mum how angry I was, because I knew that would make her upset. And be sure that if she'd ever known about my revenge thoughts, she'd no longer be that much proud of me. But for some strange reason, I assumed that it was my duty to make Dad's boss feel miserable. Anyway, 4 years have passed, and I'm a grown-up now, and I have a nice job at a go-kart track. I'm looking after those small cars just to make sure that everything's fine with them. And I race myself sometimes to clear my head, so to speak. My mum looks after my little brother. Doctors say that he's doing fine, and it's sort of my dream to show him someday what it's like to feel like a go-karter. And I've almost completely gotten rid of my obsession with the revenge and stuff. Until one day, when I saw a painfully familiar person at where I worked. It was him, Dad's former boss, Mr. Allen. I know that I'd only seen him a couple of times when I accompanied my dad to work, and I only got a glimpse, but I was pretty sure that it was him. He was there with his beautiful family, a wife and 2 kids. And all of them were happily eating ice cream and having fun. And just as soon as I saw them, I felt this growing wave of anger overtake me again, from head to toe. I had lots of jobs to do, and I thought that maybe if I just didn't look at them anymore, I could calm down. But this didn't happen. I remembered everything. My dad, his funeral and wake, that worthless check from the company, and I was so emotional that a couple of tears ran down my face. I didn't tell Mum that I saw him at my work. When later that day, she asked how I was doing. I just thought that it might have been a coincidence that his family decided to spend some time right at the track where I worked. But the next day, they came again. And then again. And I saw how his 2 kids were passionate about the kart cars. And about a week later, I'd found out that he had bought his own kart, which actually meant that I was now supposed to look after it. Of course, his has nothing to do with the cars that we were renting at the go-kart track. It was way more professional and, let's say, upgraded. It had a gearbox and a more powerful engine, and overall it was pretty awesome, and I'd be really happy to work with it. But given the circumstances, at first I tried to ask somebody else to get it prepared for a ride. But then, my boss said that the owner of this kart was willing to pay huge tips to the guy who would look after it. And I desperately needed extra money for another of my brother's treatments, so I couldn't just refuse the job. And one day, it happened. Mr. Allen came up to me and started with this small talk. He just made himself comfortable, sitting next to the place where I was working on his kart. I started asking how I liked it and what I was doing with it, and started telling me some of the stuff about how he found the seller and purchased it and other things like that. I tried to be polite and answered all of his questions, but the only thing I was thinking about was how I should resist taking something really hard and hitting him. I suddenly thought, why don't I just make a few readjustments in his kart to make an accident happen so that his son would get seriously hurt? I was already experienced enough, and I was sure I could hurt him and play everything off so that it would look like himself who just failed to control the car properly. And since I understood that Mr. Allen had no clue who I actually was, I could really take my revenge and get off scot-free. Then, at some point, I assumed that his kids were probably way too young to ride this thing, and he surprised me by saying that he was going to be the driver this time. He suddenly sighed, really heavily, and said that he was going to die soon anyway. I guess I looked really stunned, because he immediately laughed and said that 2 years ago, he'd been diagnosed with cancer, and after harsh treatment and remission, recently he found that it was back, but this time he decided not to fight it, and instead to let his children remember him as a funny dad who rides a go-kart right along with them. And then, he patted me on my shoulder, handed me $50 and told me that for some strange reason, he just decided to give it to me, just like that, and walked away. And I just stood there for a little while, still holding the pliers in my hand. I thought, what if he hadn't just confessed that to me? And I did something really wrong. How could I leave my life having committed a crime? And now I found out that the man who I'd been blaming all these years for the death of my dad has suffered a lot, and now was going to die soon himself. Maybe this will sound awful, but it seemed to me that justice has been served here. 2 months later, I heard that Mr. Allen had died in a hospital ward. I never told my mum about my revenge plan. She was too naive and pious to understand my feelings, and she'd probably stopped being proud of me for my thoughts. Although, I guess she would probably like the part with divine disposal, when Mr. Allen, for no reason, decided to tell me about his health condition, thereby preventing me from that sin.